Right, good morning, Year 12. Prepare for quite a long talk on the 24-marker question. However, I hope in the future that it will be quite useful. And we'll focus mainly on socialism, but I'm going to do general ideologies questions. So it will equally apply to looking at conservatism, liberalism, and your non-core topic, which is nationalism, not feminism. Okay? Let me move on if my recording will let me. This is a beautiful diagram. I'm not going to go into it. I'm going to make you one so that you can see. And it sums up all of the wings of ideology. You'll notice with socialism on the left, the right wing on the right, with liberalism in the middle. Many of you will know immediately, however, it's more complicated than this. It is possible to talk about the horseshoe theory. But this diagram will give you the name thinkers, it will give you the strands, and it will remind you pictorially of how the ideologies work in general. So I think it's very useful. The politics, the A-Level Politics show by Nick D'Souza is amazing. If you have a UK Spotify account, you can follow it. Anyone who's got a Spotify account in the UK, I would really beg you to subscribe to him. It's absolutely magnificent. If you don't, then probably about a third of his podcasts on Apple Podcasts. I am using Nick, and I'm acknowledging my debt to him, in particular, episode 87, How to Answer Ideologies Questions. So a lot of what I say today comes from him. I'm crediting him, okay? So 24 markers are not as long as 30 markers, which will be the other type of essay that I'll be teaching you, okay? They will always be to what extent for both 24 markers and for 30 markers, okay? And what you need to do is examine divisions, disagreements within an ideology. And so you might be looking at something like human nature, society, the economy, or the state. Now, it's good that you know that because those are the main categories, but there will be small variations on them. So your core components are conservatism, liberalism, and socialism, which you're doing with me now. And your non-core is going to be nationalism, which we'll study in great detail, okay? In order for you to complete notes for revision, I always recommend that you think in terms of a table, so that you're thinking about socialism, liberalism, and conservatism, and you're looking at human nature, the economy, state, freedom, collectivism. There are variations on those, but they will be the main categories that the questions will be on. Here's an example essay. To what extent is nationalism regressive? In other words, backward looking. Or to what extent, you're doing liberalism on the other side of the course now, aren't you? To what extent do all liberals agree on the role of the state? Now, your job in an ideologies question is to link the thinkers, but also to push them apart and to see the differences between them. Most often, I think you're going to argue in almost every ideology that the ideology mostly disagrees, nearly all of the time. Here's another one. To what extent do socialists have conflicting views on how the economy should operate? Now, we're doing socialism at the moment. You've already seen that there are very different views on socialism. However, you also want to think to yourself, do they have something in common? Now, in the mark scheme here, I'm not going to go into in too much depth. I've created a lovely version, a student-friendly version of this for you to have a look at. So we'll look at that in more depth in a minute. But just to get up to a level 5, which is 20 out of 24, which is quite hard, you need in-depth knowledge of political concepts, theories, and issues. You need perceptive analysis, logical chains of reasoning, cohesion, linking things together. And it needs to be fully relevant, and there needs to be very effective substantiated arguments. What do they mean by substantiated? Illustrated with examples, yeah? So it is a tough thing to get into level 5. Very few students do. Very good students still get an A and possibly even an A star in level 5, level 4, I beg your pardon. Now, I've told you that it's the to what extent questions, so that will always be the stem for politics essays, okay? You need a very quick answer in the introduction. You will need to define some terms, etc., but the most important thing in all politics essays is that you answer the question in the introduction. That's your AO3. You need to measure the extent. This is not a yes or no question, it's a how far. So you're looking things like, are they largely united, largely disunited? Using terms like mostly, largely, limited, mainly differing. So you are measuring, in other words, and your introduction and your conclusion need to follow each other closely. However, we also need other AO3 judgments throughout the essay. At the beginning, we need one line. At the beginning of the paragraph, in what we could call the topic sentence, you also need a judgment. What I call clincher sentences, these are very important in all essay writing subjects. It's the last sentence of a paragraph that pulls the paragraph together. I think the term clincher sentence is a good one. And of course, the conclusion should mirror the introduction. Now, using the strands, each and every one of the ideologies has strands, and it's your job to split them and also to combine them to see if they have any common ground, but usually to split them and to show the differences, why they're different, what would the outcome of that difference be. Now, you should never write about one strand in a paragraph. They are always comparative paragraphs. I'll be modeling that for you. You don't begin with thinkers. You begin with the strand, evolutionary socialism, and you go to the thinker, Anthony Crosland, like that. So an example is classical liberals and modern liberals largely agree about the role of the state. That's my beginning sentence. Can you see that it's comparative and that it's going to have two strands in the paragraph? So you don't want what they call island paragraphs where you're just talking about one strand of the ideology. You want to mix them together. It's extremely important in all essay writing that you signpost the question. So the kind of sentence stems that I'd encourage you to use are, these points are relevant to the question because. It's a great sentence to use because you're focusing onto the task. You're showing the examiner that you're razor focused on the purpose of that essay. Also, you need to explore the consequences. This is how you turn AO1, which is about knowledge, into AO2, which is about analysis and application. So you'd say, the consequence of this, what will happen as a result of these beliefs is da-da-da. And when you exemplify and you show the application of something, then you're earning marks for AO2. As an examiner of politics, I find students put in too much AO1, facts, 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 and not enough AO2 and AO3. And as I illustrate here, since liberals see human beings as predominantly rational, they believe that the role of the state is, so I'm analyzing, aren't I? I'm saying this belief system will result in this particular form of government. Does that make sense? Yeah? It's very important that throughout a 24 marker that you have comparative language. And that's because you are comparing the strands all of the time. So to get to level 4, there has to be consistent comparative analysis. So you want terms like similarly, likewise, when you're drawing comparisons, when you're showing like on like. But you also, and I think you'll use these more often, need contrastive connectives. In contrast, whereas, a very different interpretation is, etc. So that comparative language, when you go through your essay, you should be able to highlight it and see that there's a great deal of those comparative connectives. Examples are really important. I'm taking one from nationalism, which you're going to study with me next after socialism, okay? The Nazi occupation of Poland in 1939. When you study nationalism, you're going to study expansionist nationalism. And as its name suggests, that means they want to expand and go further. Some nationalists just want to concentrate on their country. Other nationalists are expansive, such as the Nazis. Here's another one. Post-colonial nationalists would abhor this action because, now when you study post-colonial nationalists, you'll see they're not militaristic. They're not into war and expansion. They're about getting their countries back after colonialism. So you might want to talk about, say, my country, South Africa, or where my mother's from, Zimbabwe. These were British colonies that became very, nationalistic about getting their country back. Key thinkers obviously are really important. You need to mention at least 2, but it would be much better to mention 4 or 5. Don't just litter them, though, so that you're just listing. Make sure that you say something about them. And I want to remind you that essays are strands-led, not thinker-led. So you go strand to thinker, yeah? But don't just simplify the thinkers or pigeonhole them. There are big differences between them. We've seen, haven't we, that between Marx and Rosa Luxemburg, there are actually quite significant differences, even though both of them are revolutionary socialists. And say something specific about the key thinker. You know, Beatrice Webb believed that gradualism was the answer, and go into some depth and explain it. Don't just put a name in there, you know, attribute some real specific thought to her. Now, what do you do in the conclusion? Well, when you read your introduction and when you read your conclusion, they should mirror each other perfectly, shouldn't they? So that shows the coherence and the logic. Why do you think this is what I would put into the conclusion, okay? Why is this the case that they disagree so much? Get to the root, get to the center of the disagreement, okay? And you can repeat some of the key headlines, but don't try to summarize the whole essay. Both introductions and conclusions should be short and sharp. You've got a 24-mark essay, you've got 32 minutes to do it. So you do not have time to waste words. Every word should be focused and relevant to the question. Now, what I've done is I've created, in your booklet, I've created a few paragraphs to illustrate things. They're not perfect, but they do illustrate some things that will be of use to you. Here's a classic question. To what extent do socialists agree on the issue of workers' control? This is one that you might get. And here is an introduction. Workers' control refers to the management of the means of production by workers rather than the middle class. Notice the definition. This could either be directed through collective ownership or indirectly through public control. That's important because that's going to be the difference between revolutionary and evolutionary socialists. While all societies advocate for the rights of working people, it does not necessarily follow that they all advocate for workers' control of industry. Here I'm going to show the differences. In order to answer this question, the following needs to be considered: the role of class in the theory and how industry should finally be organized. Ultimately, socialists do not widely agree on the theory of the importance of workers' control. That's the most important. I now know, as an examiner, exactly what the student's going to argue. He's defined the terms, or she, sorry to be sexist, and given a sense of direction of what will be covered in the middle of the essay, the kind of burger of the essay, the meaty bit in the middle. The conclusion should mirror the introduction. In conclusion, it's clear that socialists do not agree. Nice, clear thing, yeah? Whilst there is clear agreement between revolutionary socialists and democratic socialists on class struggle, both social democrats and third-way socialists question the importance of class struggle in society. I'm splitting the evolutionary and the revolutionary socialists. Further, while revolutionary socialists and democratic socialists agree industry should be organized with workers in control, either directly or indirectly, third-way socialists reject this entirely. When you are doing your disagreement on socialism, which type of socialism is always an outlier? The third way. So you'll always be using that argument because it's so distinctly different that some people would argue that it's moving into conservatism or moving into, a more of a liberal approach. Here's another one that's mercifully a bit shorter for you. To what extent do socialists agree over the state? A very classic one. Socialism traditionally opposed a capitalist society while supporting common ownership of the economy and social systems to promote an egalitarian society. Initially, I show how they agree. To achieve these goals, different socialists introduce different ways the state can provide to create a more equal society. This leads to a disagreement among socialists. It's a lovely way of organizing your introduction. Can you see why? You show the commonality of the ideology, but then you are now moving into your argument which is that they're going to largely disagree, and you're doing AO2 because you're showing where that disagreement stems from. And it's nice, it's concise, isn't it? Remember, politics, you've got to write fast. You've got to, it's very hard to finish politics papers. You've got to be razor sharp, you can't waste words. Conclusion that fits with the introduction. In conclusion, this essay has displayed the ways in which socialists came to an agreement over the state's role, but essentially has made evident that there are more areas of disagreement. The key thing there is I know exactly what it argued, yeah? For example, some socialists call for eradication of state intervention, and that's obviously going to be the third way, and ending there, thus demonstrating that there's more disagreement than agreement over the role of the state. The most important thing in these essays is that the examiner must see what your judgment was clearly. So you need to think, remember I said it's not yes, no, it's like having a line, a continuum. You need to put yourself on that line, don't you, to say mostly agree or mostly disagree, make it clear where your judgment is going to be. Now, the wrong thing to do, look at this structure here. Strand 1, here you look at strand 1. Strand 2, here you look at another strand. And strand 3, here you look at another strand. Remember what I said? These are island paragraphs. Very bad. You're not going to get a good grade for that. Avoid that. We have to go for the comparison within paragraphs. Now, there are different ways of doing this. I've taken this from the Pearson textbook. I think it's quite helpful. If you are arguing that there's more disagreement than agreement, which I think is 90% of the time, in paragraph 1, you agree. In paragraph 2, you disagree. In paragraph 3, you disagree. If you're mainly going to go for agreement, a good structure is agree, disagree, agree. However, you can also, guys, just have 2 paragraphs. And if you listen to Nick D'Souza, that podcast, he calls them super chunky paragraphs, where you have a really longer paragraph. So what am I illustrating to you? There's not one way of doing this, but the key thing is comparison. Comparison followed by judgment. Here's another one. This is the last one. To what extent do socialists agree on the role of the state in achieving socialism? Okay. Now what I'm going to do is look at the middle bit of the essay and how it should look. Okay. Paragraph 1, what is the agreement within socialism? Sometimes this paragraph might be quite short because the agreements are really not very profound. There is broad agreement amongst evolutionary socialists that the state plays an important role in achieving socialist goals. Social democrats such as Webb, I go into that. Similarly, you see the comparative language? Social democrats like Anthony Crossland, I'm showing the similarities, and even the third way, Tony Blair and Giddens, has some relationship with them. So that's my similarities paragraph, yeah? For these traditions, then, the state is viewed as a positive agent. There I'm showing. Which group have I left out, though? I've left out the strand of revolutionary socialism. I've drawn parallels between the different types of evolutionary socialists. Why can't I do the revolutionary socialists? Because their attitude to the state is so profoundly different. It's about blowing it up, isn't it? And reforming it. Paragraph 2, this is the disagreement. This is between social democrats and the third way. We know what that is. Crossland believes in some state ownership, the ownership of the commanding heights, the idea of the cradle to the grave, you know, the Nye Bevan Labour government of 1945. And then in the middle of the paragraph, I do the in contrast. What are the third way thinkers? And then I go to Giddens. What do they believe? They think we shouldn't have this intense, concentrated state ownership, that globalization has meant that this is out of the way. You could mention there we've had the deindustrialization of the West anyway. And they don't support punitive taxes, do they? They see a strong rationale for market forces. And my clincher sentence then is, therefore, while both currents see the role for the state, social democrats favor a more interventionist and redistributive model, whereas the third way envisaged a streamlined, enabling state. Why is that clincher sentence so important? Because it tells the examiner exactly what that paragraph argued. Do you see that? Now, if you're a history student here, or any of the essay writing subjects, it is a beautiful technique to pull your paragraph together and have a kind of interim judgment, interim conclusion at that point. Paragraph 3, this is the last paragraph. Disagreement with revolutionary socialists. Now, notice the language, a more fundamental disagreement. Why do I say fundamental? What does that word mean? At the base, really central. So the biggest disagreement is going to be between evolutionary and revolutionary socialists. And I've got Marx and Engels there. I've got Luxemburg, who rejects the gradualism. And what is my conclusion, my clincher sentence? Revolutionary socialists thus view reliance on the state as a betrayal of socialism's emancipatory goals, contrasting sharply with the Social Democrats and the Third Way. Marxists would see the idea of a welfare state as charity, as unjust, as not really going to the heart of solving inequality, wouldn't they? They want to blow it up, and they want a dictatorship of the proletariat, at least initially. In conclusion, you'll be glad I'm nearly finished. Isn't it a beautiful graphic? One thing I like about the USSR is its art. It's stunning, isn't it? Remember, answer the question, the extent to which. That's the key thing. Compare within paragraphs, strands first and thinkers later. Do not forget AO2. It's really key that you analyze, you exemplify, you show that you are able to apply it into a society. Don't forget you need a clear conclusion which mirrors the introduction. Good luck with your 24-marker essay.